This season will be big for the development of Jaquan Brisker and should key us in a little more to the long-term future of the Chicago Bears safety position.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And on the show today, we continue our Chicago Bears training camp previews, now looking at the safety position. On Monday's podcast, we talked about special teams. We're starting at the bottom of the roster and working our way back up toward quarterback as opposed to the traditional order that you might see people go through. And on the show today, we'll talk about Eddie Jackson and how last season was a nice return to form for him, but still I think some questions about not what the short-term and the present future looks like, short-term future, the present looks like, but maybe long-term, how much longer we'll continue to have Eddie Jackson in Chicago. Jaquan Brisker in year 2, but the potential for a slightly more advanced role this year, doing a little bit more with him, and whether or not that's what's best for his development just yet, or what we want to see from him in year 2. And we'll wrap up looking at the others at the safety position on the depth chart, and whether or not you've got some potential heir apparents there, or the 7th-round picks and former undrafted free agents, if anything there might give us some optimism that they can develop into something a little bit more than we might expect given their draft status. But I want to start with Eddie Jackson as the elder statesman of the Bears secondary, one of the longest tenured players on this Bears team and certainly on this Bears defense. He's a leader, and he's an important part of not only the safety position, but everything across the board there. 2022 represented a little bit of a bounce back for him, at least in terms of statistics, which, interceptions and pass breakups are not always the best way to measure how good a safety is, but Eddie went, a couple seasons without an interception and then got 4 again this past season. And it felt like he was able to be a little bit more of a playmaker again than we had seen, in the previous years under, ever since Vic Fangio, right, with Chuck Pagano and Sean Desai as defensive coordinators. Jackson just didn't quite feel quite like the player we saw early in his career. But this last season, we saw more and more moments like that. But yet, at the same time, we come into this season with some confidence in Jackson, feeling like, all right, we know what we're getting, and he's going to be a solid, consistent safety. There's no doubt about that in my mind. But the question becomes, how much longer, right? That Eddie Jackson will turn 30 in December, which is not old, but it is old on this Bears team. He's one of the oldest players on this Chicago Bears defense. He's also due to make $17 million this year. I think the second highest paid player on the roster behind Tremaine Edmonds and his new contract. I think, and next year in 2024, Jackson will be set to cost $18 million. He'll turn 31, and then he'll be a free agent the year after that. This season, he'll be the 5th highest paid safety in the NFL in terms of cap hit this season. And if he can continue his level of play, then he's worth that, right? I mean, there's a reason the Bears have kept him around, even though when Ryan Poles first came in, there was some question as to whether or not Jackson would be a part of that transition and part of, the next regime of Bears. As they were getting rid of more expensive, more experienced players on the roster, we wondered whether Jackson might be that guy, in part because there were some questions about the quality of play and whether that was matching the level of salary that was being paid to him under the contract signed by Ryan Pace, not Ryan Poles. But when Jackson has a more productive season, at least box score-wise this season, and there's some decent debate as to how well he was playing even while the interceptions weren't there in previous seasons, but still it feels like, he's he's getting back into more of that like natural Eddie Jackson style. Now you feel like, okay, like as long as he keeps that up, he's worth the salary, certainly. It's just a matter of how long does he keep that up? And even if he does keep that up through the remainder of his current contract, he'll be a free agent in 2025. He'll be 31 at that point. And then, are the Bears going to want to pay or want to employ a 31-year-old starting safety? Do they want to be younger at that point? Or at that point, are they more committed to like winning now because of championship windows and are more likely and would be more likely to keep a player there? But then what's the value you put on a 31-year-old safety who's still playing well? But, is there a challenge there in negotiating that? Or, how the Bears approach that long-term with Eddie Jackson is really going to be interesting. I think it could be hard at times this season to fully evaluate how well Eddie Jackson's playing because we have all these questions about the Bears pass rush, and that if the pass rush struggles, then that means the safeties and cornerbacks and linebackers are going to have to cover longer. They're going to remain in coverage longer if there's not as much pass rush hurrying the quarterback, and sometimes that can make then the coverage defenders' jobs more difficult and maybe make them look worse because they ultimately give up the catch because they can't cover forever on the back end while the pass rush maybe isn't at times hurrying the quarterback as much as you need to. At the same time, he dealt with that last year when the pass rush was also not very good down the stretch. It's worth noting, last year Eddie Jackson kind of had a bounce back. We mentioned with 4 interceptions last year. 3 of those 4 interceptions came in the first 4 games. I think it was week 1, week 2, and week 4. He had interceptions, and then he had won the rest of the season. And those first 4 games when the Bears were 2-2, they were a little more competitive in those games and playing, I think, at not like the highest level of their whole season, but playing in certainly closer games that would put the defense in better positions in some of those games. And then from there, Robert Quinn gets traded, Roquan Smith gets traded, and the defense loses a bunch of talent, and the team as a whole loses 10 games in a row or whatever it was over that stretch. And then he only had 1 interception the rest of the season. And so it's tough because you wonder like how much of that is separate, how much of that is combined, and how well we can, on the outside truly evaluate how well Eddie Jackson is doing. Certainly the All-22 tape gives us a lot of the information there. And I think, again, like the confidence level is there that he'll be fine this season. It's a matter of how much longer he'll continue to play at a high level. And if he does continue to play at a high level, how much longer the Bears will want to pay that. And what would happen then, when his current contract situation runs out, and whether or not, he's here for 2 more years or whether he's here for 4 or 5 more years, or whether or not 1 more year. If the play level drops off, the salary does not. You wonder if the Bears become ready to make a move there. But they don't exactly have his replacement exactly groomed on the roster and ready to take over for him either. So there's some different dynamics there. There's also some thought that maybe his role could look a little different this season if Jaquan Brisker's role looks a little bit different this season. We've already heard a little bit about what that might look like, but I want to apply it more specifically here to the dynamics of the safety position right now and what we want to see from Jaquan Brisker in year 2 next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. And right now you can take your first swing at betting Major League Baseball on FanDuel, and you'll get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right, just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend on betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB, NFL futures, odds for where the Bears are going to finish this season, odds for week 1, Bears, Packers, all with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today at FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball and the NFL. Jaquan Brisker played well his rookie season. There was a lot to be encouraged about from him and not a lot to sit there and be concerned long-term. So of course he made rookie mistakes and there are things he needs to improve on, but checked pretty much the kind of boxes we were looking for from a young, strong safety in his first season. You want to see that continue with growth in year 2. And there's certainly reason to expect some levels of sophomore slumps are a very real thing in the NFL. I think it can vary a little bit by position, but certainly there's something to be said about like once opponents have a full year of tape on you as a safety, they then know a little bit more of your strengths and weaknesses and know how to attack you and how not to attack you, what positions to try and force you into that they think you might struggle in versus, stuff they might want to avoid with you. But one of the things we heard from Brisker earlier this offseason during OTAs was that there's some interest in him wanting to be able to do more in this defense, to be able to be used in more ways, to not only be the strong safety coming down in the box and being in underneath coverage, but maybe playing deep a little bit more, maybe in the slot a little bit more. And as a result, maybe trying to make that part of the defense a little less predictable, because when Eddie Jackson is the free safety and Jaquan Brisker is the strong safety, and that those are their preferred or their best roles, the opposing offense doesn't have as much to guess when the majority of the time Eddie Jackson's going to be a deep safety, and then the majority of the time Brisker's either going to be in the box or drop back as the other deep safety. Not that it's 100% predictable, but it's more predictable than unpredictable on the spectrum. And so if the Brisker kind of feels like he wants to be able to do a little bit more and take on more responsibility in this Bears defense. And I can't help but sit here and wonder, like, that sounds great, but I feel like still like Brisker should maybe like master the box safety stuff first, then expand, right? Like, not that he is bad at it now, but like he had a good start, but like let's really master it. And one season of NFL play is not mastering it. Like it felt like last year was the year where the Bears were more willing to try things, to put players in different positions and try out different responsibilities for players. Throw a lot on Kyler Gordon's plate and see how he does. Throw a lot on Jaquan Brisker's plate, see how he does, knowing that by putting a lot on their plate, they're going to fail sometimes, perhaps a lot of the time, but it's a good learning experience. And it was a season where if those players struggle or are failing a little bit, you're not too worried about losing football games, right? This is the time to sort of experiment and try things with nothing really to lose. So you have everyone do a little bit of everything. And to me, year two for both Gordon and Brisker feels like, let's lock it in. Like, let's give them not fewer responsibilities, but like, let's focus in their responsibilities and let them get really good at it, right? Let's get Brisker as good as he can at being a box safety, being that true strong safety role in this defense. And I think last year he was fine coming up in underneath coverage, covering in the flats and the little hook curl zones over the middle of the field. That tends to be what I think of as the easier stuff. Not to say that his job was easy by any means, but just like compared to what they ask Eddie Jackson to do, that seems a bit more difficult. But it depends on your skill set, certainly. But I think when we saw Brisker have to go in man-to-man coverage and cover downfield, which is part of your duties as a safety sometimes, that's where we saw a little bit more of the struggles. And again, I think if you're asking him to do more things, then you're going to put him in more of those positions that he might have been more inclined to struggle with. And I get like wanting him to get more practice and experience doing those, but at the same time, winning games becomes more important here too. And getting the best out of Brisker and putting him in the best position to be successful is a part of that. Because at the same time, like there's still things he needs to work on from last year, even in the more traditional box safety roles. He missed way too many tackles. I think he missed 17 tackles last season. Led the Bears in missed tackles. It's one per game. And I think it was 8th most among safeties in the NFL. It's worth noting, out of those 17 missed tackles, 7 of them came in the first 2 games. Missed 3 in week 1 and missed 4 in week 2. Very concentrated early on. His first couple of games, he had some trouble adjusting to making tackles on NFL ball carriers. From there, still missed 10 games over the next 15, but it certainly skews your average a bit more when they're so heavily concentrated in the first couple of games. And there was clearly improvement in that area after some very early struggles. It's also worth noting that out of those 17 missed tackles, 14 of them came in the running game. It wasn't as much that he's dropping back into coverage and missing those tackles after the catch. It's more like coming down the running game and taking the proper angle to get to the ball carrier and actually get a good clean tackle on him, wrap him up as opposed to just trying to hit him and really, filling your job in run defense. I believe both of his passing game missed tackles were in zone coverage. He didn't miss a tackle in man coverage. I think some of that is about angles and coming downhill, whereas when you're in man coverage, you're usually kind of trailing somebody, so it's just about chasing them down and bringing them down, and it's not as much specifically like the geometry of like how fast I'm running, how fast they're running, and what angle I need to take to meet them to be able to make a proper tackle on that. So I think that's an area where we can see Brisker need to improve as a box safety, particularly in the running game in that regard, but coverage as well. Covering downfield has been a little bit more of a challenge for him than staying underneath. Also not a guy that had a ton of pass breakups last season, certainly not generating turnovers in major ways. And again, that's not the best way to evaluate every safety, but that's another area where you'd like to see some growth and some progress for him in the second year before we then say, let's expand his role more. Right? I'd like to keep it a little more concentrated, a little more focused, and really get good at that. And then you can start to add even more to it, but let's master the box safety role even more in year two when it's not so brand new, it's not so fresh, it's not so trying to keep up with everything. Now, a little more confidence, a little more calm, can be a little bit more reactive, a little more instinctive, a little more proactive than just like thinking on the field and reacting, but really kind of being on top of it now in year two. That's what I want to see from Jaquan Brisker as he grows, into that real like premier pair for Eddie Jackson. I also want to see what the Bears have really behind Brisker and Eddie Jackson on the depth chart. When we don't know exactly how many more years of Eddie Jackson they're going to have in Chicago, eventually they're going to need a replacement, and even if that means somebody that they develop for a couple of years on the bench beforehand, and they've got plenty of young safeties on the roster, just not with a ton of pedigree, a couple of 7th-round picks, a couple of undrafted free agents, and a veteran who hasn't gotten much attention this year. We'll go through some of the candidates on that part of the depth chart and get a sense for what the Bears have and don't have at that spot next on Locked On Bears. With DeAndre Houston Carson still a free agent, I have a lot of questions about that. We talked about that on the Special Teams podcast on Monday. The Bears' top backup safety at this point is Elijah Hicks, the 7th-round pick from last year, who we did see play a bit down the stretch when Eddie Jackson was injured. I think Jaquan Brisker was injured at one point as well, and we got to see Elijah Hicks kind of play some more defensive snaps alongside DeAndre Houston Carson in this defense. But at the end of the day, it wasn't a ton of snaps for him at that spot. I think when I checked, he played 5 games, started 2, but didn't finish the second one that he started. So it was, in terms of like the total number of snaps he played, it was about 2.5 games worth of snaps is what we saw of Elijah Hicks last season. Specifically dropping back in coverage, it was about 80 total plays in coverage, which is not nothing, but not enough to really make any sort of evaluation on, really whether he's any good. So like last year he was targeted 4 times, gave up 4 catches, which, okay, but 3 of those were for touchdowns, and the 4th one was a 66-yarder against the Minnesota Vikings in Week 18. So like there were some rough moments there, but rookie 7th-round pick thrown into the mix, trying to find his way in this defense when the team is losing a bunch of games. Like, I don't think to me that says, I'm not using that as a lot of strong evidence on what Elijah Hicks is or isn't. Like, I think the jury is still largely out for him. But just by default, he's kind of the third safety. Like, he's the highest man on this depth chart. He's Eddie Jackson's. I see him as Eddie Jackson's direct backup, while the current rookie 7th-round pick that they just drafted this year, Kendall Williamson, is more like Jaquan Brisker's like direct strong safety backup. Kendall Williamson built a little bit bigger. He's more of a solid, sturdy, strong safety, long arms. He's like, 6 foot, 200 some odd pounds. At Stanford, very active in the running game, not run defense, not afraid to get down there and get dirty in there, but not the most consistent in the world. Certainly missed more tackles than you'd like to see for a strong, long, strong safety, like physically strong, but also strong safety who has some length. And there's some real questions too about like range in coverage. Like, he tested decently at the combine and stuff, but in terms of like acceleration, getting on his horse and getting from his landmark to where he needed to go, there were times when it felt like maybe like the play speed as opposed to the measured speed of the combine wasn't quite what you love on the back end. That's why he's more of a box guy. I think there's certainly a lot of special teams potential there. But ultimately on defense, I mean, he's a 7th-round pick. He's going to be a bit more of a project in that regard. But like at the same time, like the safety depth chart, he's kind of their top option at backup strong safety. There's really not much as far as depth here. You've got Adrian Colbert, who was brought in late last season I think he was on the practice squad and then active roster, didn't play on defense, but played some special teams. He's been around the NFL. I think this will be his 7th season in the league. I think he's also 29 like Eddie Jackson, but like he's bounced around the NFL quite a bit. He's played for pretty much a different team every year. Started 3 games in 2021 for the New York Jets, but really wasn't that good. Started a handful of games in the past for the Giants and the Dolphins. I think he began his career with the 49ers, also as a 7th-round pick, I should mention, to go with the sort of the theme here. Every backup safety on this roster is a 7th-round pick or an undrafted free agent. Colbert, much more of a free safety, though. He's big and long, but a little more rangy, not so much like in the box guy, but a starter at free safety in the past. But if he was really good, he wouldn't be available to join the Bears late in the season and not play, right? I mean, he was behind Elijah Hicks for a reason. He's bounced around for a reason. He's got some experience, but not like a guy that teams go out of their way to keep as a really quality backup. He bounces around. He's a journeyman player for sure. You also have A.J. Thomas, who was on the team last year, was an undrafted rookie free agent last year, stuck around practice squad, bumped up to the active roster late in the season, never really played that much. And then 2 current undrafted rookie free agents they added this season, Braylon Trahan and Macon Clark. I think Clark was from Tulane. I can't remember which school Trahan has come from. And I do think those 2 are interesting to me because across the board, all of the backup safety spots to me are wide open. Hicks, clearly the front runner there, safety 3 to start training camp here, given that he made it on the field last season, the only one of the backup safeties on this roster that played any snaps on defense for the Chicago Bears last season. No, actually, A.J. Thomas, I think, played like a dozen snaps in one game. So technically, he was on defense a little bit, but virtually 0 snaps. Hicks is the only one who played meaningful defensive snaps last season on this Bears roster. So that means it's wide open. A guy like Colbert could find, for some reason, this Bears defensive scheme or whatever reason, this is the team that things click for him and it sticks, and he fights his way onto the Bears 53-man roster. Or maybe Kendall Williamson plays really well as a 7th-round safety that got overlooked, and that's something about being in Chicago and catching up to the NFL like goes very quickly for him. Or year 2 for A.J. Thomas is a big thing, and things settled in a little bit more for him, and it starts to click, and he becomes a guy who beats out other players and wins a roster spot. Because I don't think as 7th-round picks, Elijah Hicks or Kendall Williamson is really guaranteed anything in terms of a roster spot this year. Again, I'm pretty sure Hicks will be there, but if Braylon Trahan comes in as an undrafted free agent and just absolutely balls out, training camp star, preseason star, I mean, he could easily become the top backup safety. I mean, it's a great opportunity for either of those 2 backup safeties. And I just picked Trahan, basically flip a coin, but just as an example there, it certainly could be Macon Clark as well, or it could be, any of those 6 guys behind Eddie Jackson or Jaquan Brisker. I see pretty even odds almost across the board that they could make the 53-man roster. Wouldn't surprise me if Williamson is cut and put on the practice squad. Wouldn't stun me if Hicks was cut and put on the practice squad, but again, he's the favorite and likely to make the roster, but certainly the next spot after Hicks could be any of those guys. I don't think Williamson is guaranteed anything. I don't think Colbert is guaranteed anything. Colbert interests me because he's got so much more experience than the rest, but the undrafted free agents are perhaps the biggest wild card of all of them because we don't know much about them. They weren't here. We know a little bit of A.J. Thomas. We know a little bit of Elijah Hicks. I guess we don't know that much about Kendall Williamson either, but it's the UDFAs that sometimes you can find those gems that slip through the cracks for whatever reason and find their way in a training camp and become that star that everyone becomes a fan of, and roots for them to have success in the NFL. Backup safety is wide open. I think it's one of the lesser talked about, unheralded roster battles on this team is who is going to back up Eddie Jackson and Jaquan Brisker. And I'll be looking forward to seeing what that looks like at training camp this season. When we get any and all safety updates, you can be sure we'll break it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. I say that we're not daily right now. We're daily, 10 months out of the year, 10 and a half, 11 months out of the year. It's just like late June and early July. we cut down to 3 days a week like we are right now. But as we get a little closer to training camp, like mid-month here, we're going to start ramping back up to a full 5 days a week. And when training camp is in full swing, we will be too. So that's why you got to keep coming back. Make us your first listen each and every day, because every time you get a Locked On Bears podcast, that's your next opportunity to bear down.